Which brings us to tonight's talk. Again, this was due to be delivered at our AGM in March of this year, but that had to be cancelled. So I'm delighted that Bill is able to come through the wonders of technology to present it to us now. I first met Dr. Addley when he came as an assistant minister to Joymount Presbyterian Church. I was a member of First Carrickfergus, and to say that he was unconventional is an understatement. As a young fella, and you can tell that I'm much younger than he is, but I found him a breath of fresh air, and certainly very different from any other minister that I had ever come across. From Carrickfergus, he went to the new University of Ulster as chaplain. He served in 2 congregations in Ebrington and Conlig, and he also spent time in the mission field in Brazil and in Spain. And he finished his formal ministry, shall we say, as Professor of Practical Theology at Union College. As a keen historian, Dr. Addley has delivered recently 2 talks to the Society and had those published. One was on the Reverend James Hunter, and the second was on the life of Dr. Jack Weir. Tonight, he's going to examine the work of the Jungles Tribe Mission. So without further ado, let me invite Dr. Addley to address us.
Well, thank you, Chairman, Moderator Michael. It's an honor and a privilege to be able to address the members present and possibly those absent later. So I want to thank you for the invitation. I want to apologize. This dog is too old for new tricks, so I will read my script and will not call any of the modern useful embellishments to go towards such a thing. It's fortunate that this talk or lecture, whatever it is, will appear in the annual bulletin. So the one keen member will not need to take any notes. My topic is the Jungle Tribes Mission and missionary elders. The Jungle Tribes Mission was a mission of the PCI, which worked alongside its foreign mission in Gujarat. It operated as a faith mission, but one which was under the supervision of the church's mission board. This unusual hybrid was formed in 1890 in the face of strong opposition from within the General Assembly and within the foreign mission itself. It accepted young men who had not fulfilled the high academic requirements of those serving with the other overseas missions. Its field was limited to the indigenous tribes of Northwest India. Major practical problems arose when its agents began to see fruit for their labor, but were unable to baptize or celebrate communion since they were not ministers. New converts tended to drift off to other Christian churches, while the Jungle Tribes missionaries waited for an ordained minister of the foreign mission to come. A pragmatic solution was found when some were ordained as missionary elders with the authority to perform the sacraments when no minister was available. This talk discussed the birth and development of the JTM and its sometimes tense relationship with the FM. It concludes with some reflections on the implications of elders presiding at communion. We begin by looking at the first 50 years of the FM. This will help us understand the reaction and objections to the JTM on the one hand, and the enthusiasm for it on the other. The foreign mission in India, 1840 to 1890. The father of the foreign mission, James Morgan, firmly believed that since mission lay at the heart of the church should be its own missionary society, with the individual congregations acting as its auxiliaries. This explains the unusual order of proceeding with the overseas missions. First, the mission was set up. Then missionaries were selected and approached to see if they would serve. Then steps were taken to raise the funds necessary to support them. So the order mission, men, and money was followed at the inception of the foreign mission and the other overseas missions. The FM was launched with great enthusiasm, and 5 missionaries were sent to Gujarat in the 1840s. But then there was a drought until the mid-1860s. Many more workers were needed on the field, but it was proving difficult to raise enough money to send them, and they were having to seek volunteers. So central selection was beginning to be replaced by self-selection. And when the winds of revival began blowing across the province in 1859, at first very little changed. But by the late 1860s, 6 new FM missionaries were appointed. In 1869, a new field was opened in Manchuria, and in the 1870s, an additional 5 went to India. These numbers improved when a female auxiliary was formed in 1874, and single women began to be sent to India. By the late 1880s, the FM had reached one of its periodic crises. It was £4,000 in debt, and worse. This was at a time when some enthusiasts were proposing a completely new extension of the work. Various suggestions were made to reduce expenditure or increase income, including the reduction of missionary salaries, the curtailing of some missionary projects, the encouragement of the practice of tithing, and so on. FM missionaries realized from the very beginning that they could never evangelize Gujarat on their own. And from the time of their first convert, they employed native workers drawn from within their small community. But they were much slower in appointing Indian elders or ministers. Indian elders were first ordained in 1875 and ministers in 1888. The missionaries saw the need for ordained Indians to serve, but they were very reluctant to give them power. But this situation could not continue, and by the 1880s, things began to hot up. Now I want to highlight 3 things: students, the influence of Hudson Taylor, and the effects of the 59 revival. I discuss students because the JTM was formed to permit non-students serving overseas. Throughout this period, from 1840 to 1890, ministry students supported the work of the mission board in Ireland and overseas, but they decided which projects and which individuals they would support. This track ran parallel to that of the board. By the 1860s, Morgan began to realize that his top-down view of the missionary role of the church simply was not working, and the bottom-up role of students, which had been tolerated, began to be encouraged. From then on, various missionary auxiliaries were formed: Sabbath schools, congregational auxiliaries, and so on. Matters were raised to a different level with the creation of the student volunteer movement in the 1880s. Its watchword was the evangelization of the world in this generation, and each volunteer signed a statement: "It is my purpose, if God permits, to become a foreign missionary." How seriously they took this pledge was evident when, after a visiting student leader spoke in Belfast in 1888, 20 students, including 7 medics, publicly devoted themselves to foreign missions. And soon, mission boards and societies were unable to cope with the number of students applying as candidates, and later a layman's missionary movement was formed to help them evangelize the world. The influence of Hudson Taylor. From his earliest days in China, Hudson Taylor began to tear up the missionary handbook. He could not understand why the gospel was confined to the 5 treaty ports. He went inland and native. adopting native dress, and growing a pigtail. All inland China needed to be reached, and the name of his new mission made that clear. But his influence was greatest in three areas: candidates, finance, and support. Candidates. What struck people most was the candidates he accepted as missionaries and how they were financed and supported. He did not require rigid academic standards. He accepted women on the same basis as men, even to the point of sending single women in twos to man, no pun intended, mission stations in the interior, something considered shocking and even dangerous. Finance. He forbade any appeals to individuals or other money-raising schemes. So CIM missionaries went to the field without any guaranteed source of income. Friends and foes alike reckoned that you could get 5 CIM missionaries on the field for the price of 1 FM missionary. Support. He relied on the Lord and sought through prayer to raise financial support for his missionaries. He and his recently formed CIM were subjects of curiosity and appreciation among Presbyterians and many others in the 1870s. But in the 1880s, appreciation turned into amazement. In 1888, Taylor asked for 70 new workers, and within 2 years, 76 had reached China. In 1886, the CIM Council cabled home for 100 new workers and got 102. This was certainly Taylor's decade, and he was the reason why a queue of young men were waiting to go out with PCI missions at a time when the door was firmly closed to them. Hudson Taylor's influence is also clearly seen in the drawing up of the JTM statutes. And once the JTM was up and running, he and the CIM figure frequently in the missions journals and literature. Third, the effects of the 59 revival. It's difficult to overestimate the role ordinary people played in the 59 revival. It was essentially a lay movement which made a major impact on the PCI. It stressed personal conversion and holiness. And as a result, the PCI became a less reformed and a more evangelistic church. Two young ministers greatly influenced by this trend were W.J. Paton and William Rogers. Paton played a leading part in the formation of the mission to Manchuria, and Rogers could be called the founder of the JTM. Now we come to the formation of the Jungle Tribes Mission. A manuscript entitled First Stirrings or First Attempts to Get Laymen Employed in Our Foreign Mission relates the beginning of the process by which the JTM came into existence. It started when Mrs. Margaret Rogers put a question to her husband and a young visiting preacher. What ought to be done to get our Presbyterian young men employed in our own foreign mission? She felt that godly, gifted young men should be enabled to go as missionaries to India without being obliged to spend 7 years in college training. Several suitable young men were willing to go, but training requirements made that impossible. She was of the opinion that any intelligent Sunday school teacher who could learn the language could be a useful missionary to the thousands of illiterate, poor people in Gujarat. The matter was brought to the December meeting of the mission board and was further discussed at a second meeting in White Abbey Manse, this time of a clerical club, a short time later. A number of overtures relating to, quote, the appointment of unordained evangelists to labor in our foreign mission field, unquote, were presented to the 87 meeting of the General Assembly. It set up a small committee to consult with the young men who were offering themselves to serve with the FM. This committee reported to the 88 Assembly that it had consulted with the young men and had given them advice, on the course leading to ordination for service overseas. But it reaffirmed its objections to unordained workers, and it suggested a pay cut to get more missionaries on the field. These objections were based on their evangelistic concerns. The Presbytery of Gujarat explained, quote, "Since the evangelistic is the most demanding part of missionary work, any who may be sent out for that purpose should be thoroughly trained and quite capable of taking a missionary's place." A leader in the witness added its support and quoted statements of some missionaries that, quote, "The half-educated might do good elsewhere, but would never do for India because of the great difficulties they faced as they tried to reach Muslims, Hindus, and Parsis." But there were class issues as well as educational ones. It would have been difficult for middle-class, middle-aged, university-educated missionaries to accept non-graduate young men serving alongside them. The leader writer suggested a more radical solution. The assembly should find some wise and safe plan, quote, "for using all the evangelistic energy which may be lying perdu or running to waste at home." I think that's a dig at the revival. With the obstinacy of the missionaries and the polemic and vitriol of the leader in the witness, doubtless talking for more than himself, it's very hard to see how the assembly could have changed its mind. But changed its mind it did. The following year, that is in 1889, the assembly accepted a proposal to send young men to the Bhil people in Gujarat. How do we account for this complete turnaround? Having been rebuffed at the 88 assembly, it was back to the drawing board for supporters of lay missionaries. Fortunately, they had the invaluable assistance of two missionaries home from India, G.T. Ray and J. Shilade, who produced a detailed draft plan aimed at meeting the objections to their earlier proposals. It was to create a new mission in a new field to reach a new people. The JTM, working with one of India's indigenous tribes, neither Hindu nor Muslim, but mostly animist, in the inland jungle regions north of Bombay. The statutes of the Jungle Tribes mission. This plan provided the basis for the statutes of the new mission. On personnel, it states, "In selecting agents, this society will not consider a university education indispensable, but will be prepared to accept persons who have had the benefit of a good general education, have given evidence of devotion to Christ and of a truly missionary spirit, and have had experience and success in Christian work." With regard to ordination, it was feared that blurring the ordained lay distinction on the field would lead to administrative friction. So it was proposed that the Presbytery of Gujarat should act in a twofold capacity, as a presbytery and a mission council. Presbytery would do all required as a presbytery, and the rest would be done by the mission council, to which JTM agents would be invited to sit, deliberate, and vote on all matters connected to their mission. On funding, it states, "It's exceedingly desirable that the society should not divert any help of any kind from the foreign mission, the Zenana mission, or from any existing mission of our church. It should open fresh channels of pecuniary aid which would not otherwise be touched. This society, therefore, will welcome applications from candidates who, having private means, are prepared to go out in whole or in part at their own expense. Moreover, it is not the intention of this society to solicit funds, but, and the emphasis is theirs, to use such funds as may be voluntarily sent in by those who wish to aid in this effort to spread the knowledge of the gospel." On management at home, the General Committee would nominate an executive, of whom half would be ministers, and all candidates were to be examined by a committee which included the professors of theology and of biblical studies in both assemblies and McGee colleges. Candidates were also required to subscribe the Westminster Confession of Faith. The strategy of PCI's overseas missions. The primary purpose of the PCI overseas missions was evangelistic, to bring the gospel to the heathen or to the Jews. The methods used were through evangelism, medicine, and education of children. At the start, all the missionaries were ordained ministers, though efforts were made to enlist medical doctors as well. Like the mission strategy, like the mission structure, so the mission strategy, both were top-down. The PCI, with its emphasis on the centrality of the word and the importance of preaching, required its ministers to be well educated. But college education was not cheap, and so ministerial candidates tended to come from the professional and business and middle-income farming communities. Foreign missionaries going out to the field seemed to pack in their baggage, along with their tropical kit and some medical supplies, these social and economic privileges. The result was that though they did not ignore the poor classes and masses, their inclination was to seek out the upper castes, and by that means not only gain personal conversions, but also influence wider Indian society. We might describe their evangelistic strategy as use the highly educated to reach the highly educated. When it was proposed to send out less well-educated young men to join them, some serving missionaries and also ministers and board members at home resented the fact that those who had not been required to undergo the years of training nor meet its costs should be working with them. There might also have been a touch of class snobbery here. Promoting the JTM. Once assembly approval was granted, the JTM Management Committee was formed, and it set about securing new candidates and support from the wider church. They were successful in both these areas. Leading ministers and elders gave their support, and by pamphlets and other literature, they made the mission better known. And the first missionary was sent out within a year. Prayer. To stimulate prayer support, Rogers formed the, quote, Missionary Prayer Union of the Presbyterian Church in Ireland, whose members agreed, quote, to devote a portion of time every Saturday evening to prayer for the outpouring of the Spirit on our church at home and on our missions fields. In addition to petitions for the JTM, he added a weekly plan for individual and family prayers, specifically mentioning the home mission work on Monday, the Indian mission on Tuesday, the China mission on Wednesday, Africa was on Thursday, Europe on Friday, and the Jews on Saturday. On the Sabbath, prayers focused on the outpouring of the Spirit on all our ministers and congregations. The magazines of the church. The Missionary Herald ignored the 4-year gestation of the JTM, and thereafter its coverage was the briefest, sometimes introduced by phrases like, quote, we comply with the request of the secretaries and insert the following ... The council decided in March 1891 to produce an occasional paper the same size as the Missionary Herald. Soon it was replaced by a quarterly paper, and this went through many formats and titles till the 1960s. In addition to reports from the field, lists of subscribers, and other specifically JTM matters, it also included worldwide missionary information and devotional material. Hudson Taylor, Charles Spurgeon, and A.T. Pearson being frequent contributors. We now turn to how the JTM and its agents functioned. Jungle Tribes missionaries. Boyd lists 21 agents who served with the mission. From other sources, we learn of a further 20 applicants who were not appointed. There were various reasons for this. Some simply withdrew, including the only serving minister to apply, Heron of Waringstown. Some were too young. 25 was the preferred minimum age. Some were inexperienced, and some failed for medical reasons. For others, there were no openings or no money to receive them. The most prominent name of those not accepted was that of W.P. Nicholson. We've all heard of him. He was considered to lack sufficient experience of Christian work. And the most unusual was a former monk turned down because he was a recent convert. Of the accepted, some had already gained theological or missionary training, and at least one trained at the mission's expense. The preferred college was the Bible Training Institute in Glasgow, now the Scottish School of Christian Mission. The first agent to be sent to the new field was William Mulligan, who was designated in December 1890, and after language study, served in Dohad and Jalod. He had previously been a lay missionary with Great Victoria Street Church. He died of cholera and typhoid during the Great Famine in August 1900, just a few weeks after the fourth agent, R.B. Mawhinney, died of cholera. Mawhinney served less than 3 years. Isaac Sloan was another to die prematurely, this time after less than 7 months on the field in 1903. At the start, the Beale people were very resistant to the gospel, and it took 8 years before the first convert was secured. But then came the Great Famine, which was a disaster in terms of human suffering and lives lost, but also proved a great opportunity for sacrificial service. Boyd vividly describes the state of the people, quote, "Before the close of 1899, the Beales were crying to their God to send rain, but none came. Thousands of hungry people roamed the country in search of pasture for their cattle, and leaving behind a trail of dead animals to feed the vultures," unquote. At one of the first government food distributions, some Beales got a bit unruly and in consequence suffered an overly robust police reaction. After that, they were afraid to go to any government centre. The missionaries sought to give help. Mulligan provided food, collected refugees, and gathered waifs into an orphanage. Mawhinney fought hunger and pestilence and managed a government poorhouse, feeding 1,000 people, for which he received a posthumous award from the Gujarat authorities. Others offered assistance. Sunday schools and other organizations, as well as many individuals, adopted individual orphans. Large gifts came in from American and Indian donors. Schools were full and opportunities were provided to educate and train young people in useful practical skills. When the younger children got older, hostels were opened for boys and girls. All these facilities were offered within a Christian ethos which bore spiritual fruit. In addition to the new avenues of service and sources of support stimulated by the Great Famine, there was another positive result from the sacrificial service of missionaries. We've already mentioned the deaths of Mawhinney and Mulligan, but we cannot ignore the Reverend Robert Gillespie, the senior foreign missionary who served for 32 years and was the first missionary to die during the famine in June 1900. The fourth was Margaret, the wife of the Reverend W.F. Steele, who died in September 1900. These four died within a period of 3 months. They were praised in a pamphlet entitled Our Famine Martyrs. That 2 JTM agents and 2 from the FM shared in a common martyrdom raised the standing of the former in both India and Ireland. The value and respect due to Mulligan and Mowini and the association, and by association their JTM colleagues, was now much more widely recognized. Following the Great Famine, the work of the JTM became more closely linked with the FM. The lay missionaries of the JTM had worked largely in isolation from their FM colleagues, even though both were, in the last analysis, responsible to the same mission board. The JTM established 3 orphanages, but it was soon decided to put all IP orphanages under a single administration. Blair and Hannah in 1902 were brought onto the JTM Management Committee, a step in the process of incorporating the JTM into the FM. This increased respect may also have eased the decision of the Presbytery of Gujarat to ordain G.W. Blair as a missionary elder in December 2003. Blair tells us later, this ordination by a decision of the General Assembly carries with it the power to administer the sacraments in India, and thus removes a difficulty that has more or less hampered the Jungle Tribes mission in their work. Let me conclude this section with a few numbers. In the period 1890 to 1910, 10 missionaries were appointed to the JTM. From 1910 to 1930, 5, and from 1930 to 1952, 5. These figures were comparable with those of the foreign mission. Women workers with the JTM. Miss Jeannie Hannah was the first to apply to the mission. She was informed that she could not go as a lady worker, but could go as her brother's housekeeper. She declined the offer. The only woman employed on the field was a special case. After Mulligan's death, the committee agreed that his widow could stay on as matron of the Dohad orphanage until the McNeils returned from furlough. At the end of the Great War, the committee felt it was time to send out women missionaries, and advertisements were placed in the secular as well as the religious press. Miss Conn was one of 3 accepted and sent to BTI for training. Because no female companion was found for her, very reluctantly, she agreed to transfer to the China mission. 2 years later, the Zenana mission was approached about entering the field, but nothing came of it. In the 1920s, the need for a medical doctor became apparent, and a couple of qualified women applied, but neither was sent out. Indeed, no woman was ever sent out to the JTM. The difficulties were too great. Single women could only work in 2s. They required a proper bungalow, whereas some male agents lived in what were little more than native huts. They also had additional expenses, and the mission simply couldn't afford them. The last public attempt to recruit women, which I've found, was during Boyd's moderatorial year in 1947, when he assured members of the Girls' Auxiliary that, quote, the Jungle Tribes mission is calling earnestly and urgently for the help which you alone can give. Rereading this section looks too negative, so let me give 2 examples to rebalance things. Though being a temporary arrangement, when the committee extended the term as matron of Mulligan's widow, they described it as, quote, her joining the mission. And again, when another mission was having great difficulty in passing the language examination, the council was willing to take his wife's linguistic ability into consideration. It's hard to imagine the FM taking such liberties. Changes in the management of the mission. Over time, a number of major changes took place as to how the mission was managed, and I can do no better than quote Boyd. The first was have it supported by regular contributions of the whole church. The next was to bring it fully under the control of the Board of Missions, to be administered by the conveners of the foreign mission according to its own rules and regulations. The third was to permit its missionaries to pursue a course of study under the supervision of the Presbytery of Gujarat with a view to ordination as ministers of word and sacrament in connection with the United Church of North India. The last was to bring all the missionaries of our church into one mission council in India. The final years. After 1932, only 4 missionaries were appointed. Dr. Hugo Hazlitt in 1934, Sam Moles in 1947, and Cecil Courtney in 1952. There's also mention of an Adam Houston in 1952, and I haven't been able to track him. He just disappears. After the Second World War and India gaining its independence in 1947, the increasing difficulty of new missionaries gaining entry visas was matched by the decreasing need for such, because a vibrant church of Beale people was now in existence. Moles was installed in 2nd Randallstown in 1960. Courtney was placed in Springfield Road Church Extension in 65. Dr. Hazlitt was received as a student for the ministry and required to do only 1 year of theological education in 1963. He was called to Eden Dairy in 1965. Thereafter, there were no JTM people working in India. Now we turn finally to missionary elders. The term missionary elder has been used with a variety of different meanings. In the 1840s, it referred to the practice of ordaining medical missionaries as elders at their commissioning service in Ireland. There was no question of them celebrating the sacraments. I think it was to ensure that the recently formed presbytery was composed not only of ministers, but also elders. Later, the term came to refer more loosely to missionaries who happened to be elders. The first use of the term to mean those who could celebrate the sacraments was when William Mulligan reported the baptism of his first Beale convert in 1898. The JTM Mission Committee suggested that, quote, the simplest way out of the present difficulty would be to suggest to the Assembly that the Presbytery of Gujarat be instructed to ordain the missionaries as elders with the power to administer the sacraments on the mission field. The Board of Missions accepted this suggestion, and the Assembly appointed a committee with power to act. Though in 1889, leading figures had opposed the formation of the mission precisely over this question. Things, however, moved slowly. In 1902, the council made a second and this time successful request to Presbytery that Blair and McNeil be ordained as missionary elders. The following year, the Assembly agreed that power to dispense ordinances be granted to McNeil and Hannah. It would appear that not all members of the Presbytery nor of the Mission Board were very happy with this decision, and application for the ordination of David Lewis was only made when he had completed 5 years service in India. However, Such ordinations soon became the rule, and a further step was taken in 1922 when it was agreed that jungle tribes missionaries, after suitable study, be received as ministers of the Indian Presbyterian Church. A 3-year course of study based on Native Assemblies College was followed. The question of women missionary elders arose in 1950, but not within the JTM. The deputy clerk, A.J. Gailey, submitted an overture to the assembly that, quote, women missionaries shall not be ordained as missionary elders until 5 years service within the church, nor shall ordination carry with it any authority to administer the sacraments. This probably had something to do with the WAFM memorializing the assembly to become a mission of the PCI in 1949. Whoever the instigators were, Gailey was determined to fire a shot across their bows, and that included the likes of Miss Hester Stewart, one of the 3GA missionaries. She was among those obliged to leave China, and she moved to Singapore in 1949. Her recommissioning was described by an article in the Presbyterian Herald under the title, First Woman Missionary Elder, Hester Stewart BA, ordained by Carrickfergus Presbytery, 26th of February, 1952. It notes, her ordination as an elder will enable her to undertake greater responsibility in the work there, that is among the Chinese in Singapore, and she will carry with her the inspiration of a memorable service of dedication. More recently, the Mission Board has sent out missionary elders. In 1996, James and Heather Cochran were ordained by Coleraine Presbytery as missionary elders to Brazil. But like all present missionaries, they would have followed the rules and practices of the partner church. Will missionary elders with the right to administer the sacraments ever again be needed by the PCI? The only answer we can give, I think, is possibly. We have seen that restricting the presidency at the sacraments to ordained ministers is a matter of good order and not theology. So we must leave the question open. Thank you.
Bill, thank you for that. I'll give you a round of applause on behalf of everyone, but we do appreciate that, Bill. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Let me open this. If there are any questions that have arisen in your mind, if you would like to ask those to Bill now, please feel free to do so.
Or you can put your question in the chat box, which is at the bottom of your screen, around about the middle somewhere.
Two people are there.
Well, Bill, can I ask, you've touched on the friction between the JTM and FM. Was that felt throughout the church, or did the church take sides, the wider church take sides, or were they not aware of that friction?
Well, they certainly were aware of the friction, because speeches at the assembly in 87 and 88 were lively. And some of the leaders of the church, Dr. Johnson among them, felt that a two-tiered thing just wouldn't work administratively. But the two elders, Ray and Shilliday, two missionaries, they were highly respected, and they carried a number of their fellow missionaries with them, but not all of them. The elders and ministers who gathered support for them were the usual suspects, Young of or Culibaki direction, one of the Sinklers, Workmen, these kind of big hitters in the PCI were all for trying to involve more people. And I think the main driving force was, well, there was more than one, but they felt, why should we be hemorrhaging young men to the China Inland Mission and not to our own mission? And that was what got Margaret Rogers very agitated, and why she set the ball rolling in 1886.
Thank you. Any other questions? John Dunlop.
Well, thank you very much for that. I knew nothing about this really at all. So it's great to get some vast amounts of my ignorance filled with some information. Let me go back to the Beale people who were being converted. Did that become a separate church or denomination, or was it incorporated inside the Presbytery of Gujarat?
Initially, it was incorporated into the Presbytery of Gujarat, but I think in 1902, the Presbytery of Gujarat and Kathiawar, if that's the right way to pronounce it, was disjoined from the PCI and became a presbytery of, I think it's the United Presbyterian Mission in India or something. So then it wasn't answerable to Belfast. It was answerable to, I'm not quite sure where. And the Beale people were very resistant at the start, but in later years, they produced some excellent Christians who were praised by not only by the PCI, but by local people as well. They would be, I suppose, now would be called Dalits, is that the phrase, or untouchables? They were the lowest of the low, whom the FM initially tended to ignore.
Are they now a part of the Church of North India?
Yes.
Thanks, John. Any other questions?
Could I ask, Bill, on top of what you just said, would the fact that becoming a Christian gave them a dignity they didn't otherwise have been part of their thinking in becoming Christians?
Well, I think that's one factor. Another factor was they were given a kind of rudimentary education. Some of them were trained as evangelists, some as teachers. So there were opportunities for self-improvement, which they could obtain as Christians. Mm-hmm. And of course, the Hindus looked down on them and wouldn't have anything to do with them. That's still the case today, I think.
Thanks, Donald.
Could I ask a question, moderator?
Yes, absolutely.
Bill, thank you very much for a very stimulating talk. I'm interested in the missionary elders and their kind of status within the church, which you sort of began to talk about. Clearly, these were people who were ordained without having gone through the usual course of study in a kind of recognized theological college, as I understand it. And they were elders as such on the mission field. Can you unpack a little bit more how they were seen by the church once they'd been ordained? Obviously, in the code, we talk about ministers being also teaching elders. Were they sort of seen as essentially some kind of extraordinary teaching elder once they'd been ordained as a missionary elder? I'm just looking at the code in 1948, which has provision for the ordination of missionary elders. Mm-hmm. And it talks about them being ordained as and appointed as men laboring in the word and doctrine, mm-hmm. to be missionary elders. So I'm wondering, is the church sort of saying there we're seeing them as essentially teaching elders in some capacity?
Well, all missionaries do, wherever they're from, do a bit of teaching. And there were, well, the male FM missionaries didn't really enter the jungle areas. And so the teaching, the catechists, the Bible women, the evangelists, all had some training in the rudiments of the gospel and the way of salvation and that kind of thing. That wouldn't have been regarded as unusual. What was unusual was that in the circumstances when there was no ordained minister about, in those circumstances, they were able to perform the presidency, to be technical, at the sacrament was open to them. And that tells me that who administers the sacraments is a matter, as I say, of good order, not of theology. They've been accepted to do that. And I wonder in the future, when the PCI will, people have done the sums and say we're going to be 60 ministers short in such a time and whatever. In the future, when there may be a shortage of ministers and perhaps larger linkages, maybe in the south and west, but maybe in Ulster as well, it may happen that as part of that group, some elders will be given the same authority. And my own view is, I don't see it as a theological matter. But I've discussed this with people, and not everybody agrees with me, but what's new?
Well, it's certainly interesting to get the historical take, which is why I'm interested in following up on it. Bill, so can I just clarify what you're saying there is you're seeing, because they were essentially women who were missionary elders and women
No. We never had a woman missionary elder.
Oh, okay. So what I suppose what I'm suggesting to you is that when they were ordained as missionary elders, that was essentially them being perceived as, quote, laboring in the word and doctrine to be missionary elders with authority to administer the sacraments. So essentially that link between laboring and teaching and the sacraments, sacraments as an aspect of the ministry of the word, seems to have been maintained, at least in the 1948 code. Essentially, then I'm saying, are we ready to see them as really teaching elders in that technical sense, that alternative title for a minister, rather than still ruling elders who are given extraordinary permission to administer the sacraments?
I think there has never been a feeling that they were teaching elders in the sense in which, let's call them normal ministers are. The code, yes, 48 recognizes, but eventually later codes, and I think it's the 1980 code, removes that particular section, probably because the missionary elder then wasn't required. There were ordained Indians in the Indian Presbyterian Church. So, white missionary elders weren't required. And, Berkeley ignores it in his MA thesis, but then John Berkeley had a habit of ignoring things he didn't like. I didn't say that, by the way. The other thing is, when you serve overseas now, the PCI doesn't have chaplaincies like the Church of England. The PCI works with the partner church and missionaries. When I went to Brazil, I became a member of the Presbytery of Londrina and was subject to the discipline of the Presbytery of Londrina. And I was talking to the Cochrans. They went to Brazil and they were working with the Independent Presbyterian Church as church planters. And I said I rang James up to check this point. I said, church planting, what about baptizing converts? And he said, well, we just got on with it. And the IPI didn't raise an eyebrow. I was very surprised when I saw, not very long ago, a photograph of a church notice board in Europe, in one of our partner churches, which talked about the Presbyterian Church, when it wasn't a Presbyterian church. It was a church of our partner, which it, in fact, was a united church. But I've raised the question with some of the mission board leaders, and they didn't really want to discuss the matter, so I didn't pursue it.
Maybe they hadn't got around to painting the notice board.
I don't want to take that any further because I think I don't want to open that particular case.
Thanks, Bill. Any other questions?
Good.
Well, I think as John was saying earlier, Bill, you have filled in great gaps in our knowledge, or should I say you have filled in great gaps in our ignorance. Certainly this was something that I was not particularly aware of, and while I had heard of the Jungle Tribe Mission, I really didn't know an awful lot about it. So
there's been very little work done on it.
Yeah. Thank you for that tonight, and I'm sure we all have appreciated it.
Well, it was rather long, and I think I was going like the clappers, and I apologize if I was going too fast. I don't know whether Ivor Smith will let me expand a little on what I have written here for the bulletin, because I would like for future researchers to put footnotes and give my references and sections I've cut out. But I'll talk to Ivor about that and what space he's going to give me on the bulletin.
You can have the space that you wish, brother.
That's dangerous, Ivor. That's dangerous.
As long as it's not as long as the Jack Weir book or the James Hunter book. You're not getting that much space.
Okay.
I'm assuming, Bill, that you have or somebody has a full list of those who served with the Jungle Tribes Mission, because I think that would be useful.
It's in Boyd's prevailing word.
Yeah.
Word, right?
Yeah.
Right.
There are some discrepancies between it and other lists, but they're minimal.
Right.
So that's where you'll get that.
I will certainly extend it slightly as you need to, as long as I get your manuscript for the end of the year.
Okay. Thank you for that indulgence.
Ivor is always dealing in grace. Well, folks, again, on your behalf, can I thank Bill for the work that he's put into this and for the help that he has given to us in understanding it. And can I thank you for your attendance this evening. We may meet again in this way, or we may meet face to face. I'm not sure what's going to happen after Christmas, but I said earlier, our next planned talk is due to be face to face. So